our witnesses here today. From the Irish Local Development Network, Mr Joe Saunders, Mr Michael Bowe, Ms Anne Fitzgerald, Mr Eamon O'Reilly and Mr Larry O'Neill, and from SIB2, Mr Donald Coffey and Ms Caroline Kennedy. To all our witnesses, you're very welcome here today. I'll invite our guests in a few moments to make their presentations, and then members will have an opportunity to ask a number of questions. Before that, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the committee. However, if you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter, and you continue to so do, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. And members are reminded of the long-standing practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside this House or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And once again, before we commence, if you have mobile phones, you either might turn them off or to flight mode, please. So we'll start with the opening statement from ILDN. Who's going to do that? Okay, Mr. Bowe, please.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I would like to thank the Chair and the Oireachtas Committee and members present for the invite here today to respond to the Indicon report. Just to reintroduce just the members of our delegation here today. To the front on the right is Mr Larry O'Neill, who's the CEO of the South County Dublin Partnership. Joe Saunders, who is the manager of the ILDN network. To my right here, Anne Fitzgerald, who's the CEO of the Ballyfermot Chapel Visit Partnership. Eamon O'Reilly here, who's the CEO of the North East West Carey Development, and also the Vice Chair of ILDN, and myself, Michael Bowe, CEO of the Dublin North West Area Partnership and Chair of ILDN's Employment and Enterprise Committee. And I suppose this paper is also part of a second paper that will be setting out to government a model for national employment services based on a not-for-profit model delivered by local development companies. And the service of this will be characterised by a more targeted approach, nationwide coverage and an additional focus of resources on communities in which the numbers of unemployed, underemployed and on other welfare payments remain high. So just by way of introduction, and now I'll just go straight into the paper which you've received a full copy of, and we're reading out a summary version. So Irish Local Development Network is the representative body for the country's 49 not-for-profit local development companies that deliver community services across the country. Local development company boards comprise of local voluntary directors alongside public sector personnel and in many cases employers, union and elected representatives. They link to local economic and community plans and local community development committees, ensuring wide-ranging oversight and democratic accountability. Each year, LDCs support circa 15,000 community groups and 173,000 individuals by delivering 330 million worth of state programmes. Many for job seekers, including Back to Work Enterprise Allowance, TUSA and RSS schemes, local employment services, jobs clubs, community employment and jobs initiative. Currently, 19 local development companies manage 23 local employment service contracts, and the remaining 3 are also managed by not-for-profit organisations. These activation supports are integrated with other social inclusion supports, facilitating job seekers to simultaneously avail of complementary services such as training, childcare and health promotions, for example. In 2017, Indicon International Economic Consultants completed reviews of the local employment services and jobs clubs across the country. It should be borne in mind that in 2016 the LES service had been considerably altered from its original purpose and formulation, focusing on long-term unemployed, to a caseload and purpose reformatted for crisis times. Hence, the evaluation was not focused on the LES model as it was originally designed, but rather a reformulation that was rapidly constituted. We are now in an era more akin to what the LES was originally designed, and this submission, while addressing the content of the evaluation, will have a later focus on the employment services model required for today's operating environment, as I alluded to at the very start. The value of LES and jobs clubs under review in 2016 was circa 25 million. Combined, the services employ circa 400 qualified and experienced staff. And in 2016, the LES service assisted over 47 and 25 individuals, and Jobs Club assisted a further 19,663, a combined total of circa 66,000 unemployed individuals in 60 separate locations across the country. Indicon reported that LES achieved a placement rate of 28.8% against a target of 30% set by the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection, DASP. It should be noted that only employment over 30 hours per week is included in this figure. Excluded and not measured are jobs under 30 hours and placement in training, education and other necessary progression activities for those most distant from the labour market. It is against this background that the 28.8% achievement is independently evidenced that the LES/Jobs Club performance is excellent when compared with like operations nationally and internationally. Interestingly, 75% of LES clients reported that their interaction with LES had motivated them to seek work or undertake further education or training, and a further 71% of LES clients said that the LES supports had improved their employment prospects. 89% of employers surveyed reported that the LES had helped their organisation find suitable candidates for vacancies, and 83% of employers reported that the LES had proved an efficient recruitment service for their organisation. So the two Indicon reports over 300 pages, and whilst there are many findings which we could engage with in more detail, the focus is rightly on the future. In that regard, Indicon have made 7 recommendations, and we will use our time to discuss the merits or otherwise of these. Recommendation 1, merger of the Jobs Club and local employment services. This first recommendation is that given their close relationship, consideration should be given to merging Jobs Clubs and local employment service. ILDN believes that this recommendation will provide for a more integrated service for job seekers. Under governance, Indicon recommends that LES and Jobs Clubs contractors should adhere to best practice governance. ILDN fully supports this recommendation and notes currently that all LDCs are registered companies with voluntary boards of directors. They are all registered charities, and all LDCs with an LES/Jobs Club contract hold the Q-Mark standard. As the company holds contracts for several programmes across many funders, there are multiple accountabilities in place, including the Office of the Director of Corporate Enforcement, the company's registration office, Revenue Commissioners, the European Social Fund, the Charities Regulator, funder audits, as well as oversight through the local community development committees and linkage to the local economic and community plans. The resources for LES and Jobs Club. ILDN Indicon states that given the very significant reduction in the levels of unemployment, that this should be reflected in the overall resources provided for the LES and Jobs Clubs by the state. ILDN fundamentally disputes the logic of this assertion. As employment recovers from crises, those who are most job-ready return to employment first, and they require the lowest levels of intervention and support. Local development companies and their LES operations work with those most distant from the labour market. Therefore, lack of marketable skills allied to social barriers require deeper and longer intervention than that required in a recovering economy with 16% unemployment. At this point in our post-recession environment, the marginal cost of assisting others to access the labour market rises. 4, focus on the most disadvantaged and other activation groups who are not currently obtaining assistance from the state-delivered funded programmes. ILDN agrees with the configuration and resourcing of employment services in this way. Given the current buoyancy of employment creation, the supports of those not currently on the live register or able to access what the International Labour Organisation calls decent work should be actively pursued policy objective. Multi-annual contracts. This supports recommendations that DASP should consider multi-annual contracts in order that delivery agents can plan effectively. Is welcomed by ILDN, whose members already successfully operate multi-annual contracts such as the SICAP programme. Configuration of local employment services. We will reverse the order of recommendations 6 and 7 in order to give more time to future services. So Indicon recommends that amalgamation of services may be required in order to achieve greater economies of scale. ILDN note that there are multiple numbers of TS, TUS and RSS contracts, multiple numbers of SIPCAP contracts by county, and while economies of scale should be explored, the grounded and local nature of TUS and RSS and SIPCAP by county and in agreed lots areas in local development companies are major contributing factors in their success. The contracting departments of the Department of Rural and Community Development and DASP itself can testify to the effectiveness and efficiency of contract management by small teams in each area. Procurement. Indicon recommends that active consideration is given to an open, public, competitive procurement model by future provision of services, and DASP has indicated that it is preparing to follow this recommendation and procure the services within the next 3 months with a view to having such contracts in place for January the 1st, 2020. ILDN makes the following observations. Firstly, there are many good examples of state-funded programmes that are not contracted through an open procurement model, particularly in the labour activation area. Secondly, if there is to be a new procurement process, it should keep the needs of job seekers and value for taxpayers at its core. This will require an objective assessment of all inputs and deliverables. Currently, effectiveness of employment services is evaluated by a single indicator, placement in employment of 30+ hours per week. If commissioning is to be considered, it must fully take into account the objectives of the service and the cost of delivering all parts of that service, including the elements of the journey to job readiness. Thirdly, international experience in competitive contracting of employment services by a payments by result model has yielded unsatisfactory and unintended results. I refer the committee to relevant academic research literature, in particular the work of Greer and others. The downsides of a privatised pay for results model can include removing experience that eliminates community organisations, i.e. those with a track record, from competing. Local development companies as delivery agents for government are generally prohibited from retaining a profit on most of their programmes, including LES, and thus their lack of reserves will remove them for a payment by results model. Gaming the system by creaming, or otherwise prioritising the low-hanging fruit, parking those most distant from the labour market, and coercion of those who wish to build a career rather than accept low-pay, precarious work are among the methods identified in the research. Whilst open commissioning may initially appear attractive in cost terms, these are quickly offset by increased and often unclear procurement costs. Most crucial, however, is the likelihood that the taxpayer will be tied into expensive, inflexible contracts, often designed for a different phase of the boom-boost cycle. They compete with existing funded state initiatives to the detriment of the latter. So ILDN recommend that whatever procurement model is devised, it needs to take cognizance of the social inclusion aspects of delivering an employment service targeted at people most distant from economic activity, the not-for-profit contract model operated by the Department of Rural and Community Development, example SICAP. LDCs, given their national coverage, provide a ready-made and workable solution to the challenge of reconfiguring employment service to include large elements of social inclusion work with targeted cohorts. The success of TUS, RSS and the Back-to-Work Enterprise Allowance schemes are current examples offering value for money and agility to the contracting departments. Any changes to the current model require a greater lead in time than proposed, given the need for an ongoing service to job seekers, the rights of employees and the proper planning and development to be undertaken by boards of local development companies. Above all, the LDC capacity for full wraparound service integration is required to meet the needs to today's job seekers. The need for such an approach is independently identified by the EU Country Report on Ireland 2018. Quote, some progress made with the presentation of the Action Plan for Jobs as Household, but groups furthest away from the labour market still require an integrated approach to helping them enter it. So in conclusion, Irish Local Development Network recognises that public employment services need ongoing adaptation to meet the changing needs of job seekers, but points to the success of the not-for-profit community model since 1991 and its greater effectiveness over a privatised, payment-by-result model in addressing deep-rooted unemployment. The reconfiguration of the community-based model for the current challenges offer job seekers and employers and the state the optimum solution. Accessibility, locally based but with national coverage. Agile, high performance, high governance standards linked with the local democratic processes, values driven and high personal skills. Finally, I would like to thank the committee for the opportunity of presenting here today, and we will be happy to take any questions at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bowe, for your opening statement. From SIP2 then, who's going to do the opening statement? Mr. Coffey.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. My name is Donald Coffey. I'm with Cork City Partnership, Cork City LES, and I work as a mediator, and this is my colleague, Caroline Kennedy, from Paul Partnership, and is a job club leader. So we're going to split the presentation between the two of us. Okay. So firstly, may we begin by thanking the committee for inviting us to speak today. We are here as representatives of the SIP2 Local Employment Service, that's LES, and Job Club's National Executive Committee, who represent our colleagues all around the country. The committees comprise of partnership and non-partnership LES and job clubs. The history of being here is as a result of meetings we've had with Deputies John Brady and Willie O'Dea, and we wish to thank them for facilitating our attendance here today. It's much appreciated. Just a little bit of background. We've written to the Minister for Employment Affairs and Social Protection on a number of occasions requesting a meeting to discuss the proposal of the DEASP to replace the community-based LES and job clubs with an open, public, competitive procurement model for future provision of services. We eventually received a reply offering an opportunity to meet with an official from DEASP. This meeting took place on Wednesday, 20th March, and the department official was accompanied by 2 colleagues. Our presentation today sets out the reasons why both the LES and job clubs should remain as a not-for-profit model within the community. Now, it is an honour to be invited to Leinster House in the same year that Dáil Éireann celebrates its centenary. The LES and job clubs may not have been around for 100 years, but we are approaching the quarter century, having been set up in the mid-1990s. And in fact, looking at the ILDN document, it refers to 1991. We have very much been a frontline person-centred service and have always operated in a not-for-profit structure and are an integral part of our local communities. What we would like to do here today is to give you a brief history and background to the LES and job clubs and to describe how we operate. The Interim Task Force on Long-Term Unemployment, February 1995, laid out the template for the LES, which led to the model being developed to complement and support the services. So, as I've pointed to my friends, this has survived multiple queue marks and clearing out of our offices. So this is our kind of Bible, and it was set up. In fact, I think it has multiple parentage in the sense that it crossed 2 governments, because that was a fairly tumultuous time back in the early 90s. So there's lots of claims to the success of that document. Quoting page 5, the aim of the local employment service would be to provide a gateway or access point to the full range of options which should be available to enable a long-term unemployed person return to the world of work. These include guidance, training, education and employment supports. And although many years have now passed since the publication of this report, the values and ethos that it sets down for the new service back in 1995 still very much prevail to this day, being client-centred and responsive to the individual needs of clients. It has been these clear values and operating ethos that has enabled us to be a successful service. Time and time again, we have been able to adapt our operating procedures to changing circumstances and official requirements, while remaining constant to our overall values and operating ethos with a view to increasing a person's potential employability. We are the gateway for unemployed people by virtue of our location within areas of typically high unemployment. We are ideally located when people come looking for support or wish to undertake a short training course, like job market training courses such as SafePass or forklift driving, for instance, just to give examples. Many of our long-term unemployed clients have been able to escape long-term unemployment and re-enter the world of work by doing such training. A significant percentage of those who use our service to access programmes such as community employment and TOOS have gained full-time employment thereafter. The LES and job clubs did not set themselves up to be the expert on all of these diverse areas, but rather we would establish effective networks with all the key stakeholders and other service providers. This network approach has continued right down to the present day. So I'll hand you over now to Caroline.
Thank you, Donal. Good afternoon, Chair, Senators, Deputies. My name is Caroline Kennedy and I'm a member of the SIPTU National Jobs Club Committee. I'm based in Limerick and I'm the Jobs Club Coordinator. So I'm going to run through some aspects of how we operate and what we do on a day-to-day basis. So the Jobs Club is a community-based not-for-profit model. The Jobs Club and the LESs are a local support for job seekers that match clients of the services to employment, education and training opportunities within their locality. At present, the LES operates in 25 areas and the Jobs Clubs operate in over 40 locations throughout Ireland. We are a public employment contracted service operating successfully from a not-for-profit ethos. We are based in the hearts of our communities, with local offices in communities such as Myross, Mayfield, to urban centres like Clondalkin and more rural areas such as Carey and Mayo. As both services are rooted in the community, this enables the services to have greater insights into the needs of the individual and the community needs and issues that may impact upon the employability of the individual. We have built up a wealth of local knowledge, knowing what local services and supports are available to the individual, and this allows for collaborative working relationships between multiple services. Our approach: the LES and Jobs Club work with clients from a person-centred approach with the emphasis on providing a range of personalised, tailor-made supports. We support our clients to avail of both formal and informal training. Many clients also take the first step back into employment through engaging with the various labour market programmes such as Community Employment, RSS and TUS. Both the LES and Jobs Club support clients with this type of progression. The LES has worked with and advocated with government departments to deliver specific training to meet employer and client needs and thus securing sustainable employment for clients in their locality. CE, RSS and TUS programmes are the backbone to many services operating in the communities. It is often here that the routine of getting back to work, building confidence and having a sense of belonging and purpose creates a stepping stone towards further training and employment. The supports available to job seekers through the LES and Jobs Clubs range from progression planning, guidance and mediation, addressing barriers, building confidence, training and education, access to labour market programmes such as TUS and CE, assistance with practical job search support such as CVs, interview preparation, mock interviews, post-employment supports, access to financial supports and information provision. The current climate. The recent Indicon report acknowledged that unemployment levels have fallen nationally, quoted recently by Minister Doherty as 5.3%. However, our experience of working as practitioners showed that there continues to be a client group who are very distant from the labour market and often present with multiple barriers, which can include having no work history, limited educational attainment, limited English language skills, homelessness, low literacy skills, confidence or self-esteem issues, age, distance to transport to work, training, lack of childcare supports, ill health or perhaps addictions. The current favoured work-first approach, where only full-time employment of 30 hours plus is considered a progression, is extremely difficult for people who are experiencing a variety of barriers. This is where both formal and informal supports are required to work with the individual. The LES and the Jobs Club recognise that career progression journey for those most distant from the labour market begins with the focus on working with the client at where they are at and through a person-centred approach. The Irish National Organisation for the Unemployed Services Research Report in 2016 recognises the expertise that the LES has developed in supporting people who are long-term unemployed. They further state how a good example of effective interagency and organisation work is the link with local jobs clubs. The employees of both the LES and the Jobs Club are highly qualified, trained and experienced with a vast range of local labour market knowledge, established successful networks and work in the heart of the community. Both services have a workforce that's adaptable, innovative and values the empowerment of a person-centred approach towards sustainable employment. LES and Jobs Clubs have a proven track record of responding to the needs of government. Through our flexibility and adaptability, we have proven that we are responsive, proactive, with the ability to meet the evolving demands of those who are unemployed. This is evidenced through the increased capacity of clients who were referred to the services during the height of the recession. Supporting clients in our job search. As the Indicon report describes, the objective of the Jobs Club is to provide a range of services and supports for job seekers and for employers. There are 4 elements to this service: formal workshop training, one-to-one engagement, CV preparation and a drop-in service. Clients are referred to engage in these supports through the DEASP and the LES. Formal workshop training covers a variety of topics, including identifying individual client skills with local opportunities, understanding the interview process, CV preparation, application forms, using the internet to search for jobs, group participation and motivation. The one-to-one engagement that's provided offers practical and personal support to clients on a one-to-one basis that can include everything from structuring CVs, job applications, job coaching and pre-interview support. The CV service that's available is about assisting clients with the preparation of their CV, and this is often the initial engagement in the activation process for clients. The drop-in service. Many clients avail of our facilities and resources such as internet access, computers, phones, printing, and again availing of the Jobs Ireland website. Most of our facilities around the country have been very busy last week with clients preparing for the DEASP National Jobs Week, with many jobs fairs running throughout the country. Our facilities enable clients of the services to be ready and to properly engage with potential employers at these jobs fairs. Client experiences of jobs clubs. The Indicon report states that clients surveyed for the report exceeded typical response rates, showing that 21.5% of clients responded to the survey. The results speak for themselves. 80% of clients said that jobs club supports had improved their prospects of getting employment. 79% of respondents stated that their engagement had motivated them to find work or undertake further education and training. 77% of clients said their participation boosted their self-esteem and self-confidence. 26% received assistance to find work over 30 hours per week, and 23% received assistance to find work under 30 hours per week. These statistics demonstrate to us the positive impact that Jobs Club have on clients who engage with us and are supported in their journey towards employment. The employer experiences with Jobs Club. The Indicon report further highlights the positive relationships we have developed throughout the country with employers. Some of the findings are as follows. 79% of employers said that Jobs Club helped their company find suitable candidates for available jobs. 81% of employers established effective ongoing relationships with Jobs Club staff. 86% of employers became knowledgeable of the support services available to them. 75% of employers gained employees who perform well and are reliable. 60% of employers filled vacancies that they could not otherwise fill. The impact on employment rate by Jobs Club and LES. In January 2012, the unemployment rate stood at 16%. Through the combined work of Intro, LES and Jobs Club, the rate fell to 9.3% by the summer of 2015. This equates to a reduction of 6.7% and is prior to the introduction of the Department's for-profit employment model. I'm going to hand you back to Donald, who's going to speak a little bit more about the LES.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. Uniqueness of the LES model. The LES is delivered by highly qualified staff who offer a customised, person-centred service while being cognizant of the complexity and multi-dimensional causes of unemployment and how this impacts on individuals and communities. Skilled staff focus on active listening, understanding and interpretive skills to facilitate clients who are most distant from the labour market, to address the issues and barriers which affect their ability to access employment, education or training. Future labour market changes will continue to have a significant impact upon those who are already categorised as being most distant from the labour market. This underscores the need for a guidance-focused mediation services for those most in need, namely the model practiced by the LES. We believe that this unique model should be available throughout the state and that a proposal from the Irish Local Development Network ILDN paper in November 2013 should be revisited. This paper proposing extending LES to areas of the country which currently do not have the service. We believe that the LES is a proven model of best practice and one that should be available throughout the state. This would allow for the development of a bespoke employment service based upon local area need. And quoting Murphy and Dean, There, in the crowded and increasingly competitive activation space, the LES is very well positioned, integrated and embedded in the communities of interest with highly and relevant skilled staff. Current EU policy affirms the LES in the landscape of activation policies and services, restates its core and unique selling point, its closeness to its customer base, its specialist skill set and its integrated position within the topography of community, voluntary and statutory services. That's Murphy and Dean Report 2016. The LES Model and Pathways to Work 2016-2020. A major element of the Government's Pathway to Work 2016-2020 focuses on the consolidation of existing activation services and expansion of same to new groups, including one-parent families, people living with a disability, job seeker, transition recipients, part-time employees, qualified adults. This element is reflected in one of the policy recommendations contained within the Indicon report, LES 1. We recommend that the LES should in future focus on the most disadvantaged activation and other client groups who are not currently obtaining assistance from other state-delivered funded programmes. We view this as a positive element to the report, as groups listed above are the very people that the LES was established to work with. It is their original client base. The current skill set of the LES is extremely well placed to meet the needs of the above, as it is what the service has done for over 20 years. The Indicon report highlighted that 70% of LES clients state that their engagement with LES has motivated them to find work or to undertake further education or training, while 71% of LES clients said that the LES support had improved their employment prospects. And just quoting Murphy and Dean again, the skill set and guidance counselling orientation of the LES showed that it is best qualified and most ready to embrace the following target groups: long-term unemployed of more than 2 years, youth unemployed, those with educational disadvantage and specific, sometimes gendered barriers, older, longer-term unemployed men, female lone parents and qualified adults. Migrants will be of increasing relevance. The LES is particularly well placed to respond to such needs and work with local goals and targets and focus on the very long-term unemployed. Return on exchequer investment for LES. So the next part there, the LES return on exchequer investment. So I'm going quoting some research. An analysis of the Mayo LES discovered that the service costs €87,480 with return a minimum of €1,960,860 million to the state. The probability formula used for this study is also used by the UK Centre for Economic and Social Inclusion. This organisation is trusted and indeed favoured by the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection, as it was hired for its cost modelling work for JobPath. This Murphy and Dean. Ballymun Job Centre 2016. In April 2016, the Ballymun Job Centre conducted analysis of its LES to discover the gross and net cost of the service, and conservative study approach was adopted, as not all job-placed clients were counted. Even with such a conservative approach, a net cost of €125,626 was generated. That's Murphy and Dean. Indicon Report 2018. The cost per full-time employment is €2,544, and this figure is further reduced when part-time employment is factored in. This compares favourably, extremely well, to the €3,718 per full-time employment placement attributed to the private JobPath service. It is important to note that this figure of €2,544 does not take into consideration savings the state will make in less welfare transfers and income it will receive in relation to tax receipts. The Indicon report outlined that the LES has achieved a progression rate of 28.8% into full-time employment of 30 hours or more. The above examples briefly outlined the monetary benefits provided by the state to the state by the LES. However, when measuring the true worth of an employment service, it is vital to recognise the existence of non-monetary value. The non-monetary value inherent within a community-based, not-for-profit employment service helps to create social and economic benefits for the wider community. Such a return cannot be achieved through a payment by results service, as it is, and can only occur through a service that is client-centred, holistic and not motivated by profit. It should be noted that the capacity of the LES to work with it in its original ethos and guidance model was impacted by the economic crisis the restructuring of FOSTA, LES being subsumed into INTRIO, adoption by the LES to the INTRIO administrative architecture and case management system has meant a narrower interpretation of outcomes, as there is an emphasis on only counting full-time employment as an outcome of 30 hours plus. Moving on then to open, public, competitive procurement model and services of general interest. A policy recommendation arising from the Indicon report for both LES and job clubs is that active consideration should be given to an open, public, competitive procurement model for future provision of services. Minister Doherty and officials in the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection have stressed that an open, public, competitive procurement process must occur due to the perceived requirements of EU competition policy and rules pertaining to state aid. We would question this. A clearer reading of EU guidelines on competition policy and rules pertaining to state aid outlines how Member States can work within the EU procurement environment while still protecting services of general interest. It is our view that the LES and job clubs fall under the category of services of general interest, and in doing so it can be protected from an open public competitive procurement process. Services of general interest expressly include services provided directly to the person, such as social assistance services, employment and training services, childcare, social housing or long-term care of the elderly, and for people with disabilities. That's Murphy and Dean, 2016. We share a lot of concerns about the impact of open public competitive procurement to the community and voluntary sector. In the UK, open public competitive procurement or commercialisation and privatisation of many community and voluntary sector activities has had a hugely detrimental impact on the work and independence of the sector. Community Workers 2015. Open and public competitive procurement contracts, such as the original job tender, make payment conditional on results, thereby inserting a profit motive and insist on a minimum company turnover per annum. In the original request for tender for JobPat in 2014, a minimum of €20 million turnover per annum was needed for any would-be bidders. Any future open public competitive procurement that may arise from the Indicon report with such a condition attached would automatically exclude the community and voluntary sector from participation and see to the wholesale closure of the vastly experienced and successful LES and job clubs network. So I'll hand you back there to Caroline for the last section.
Yep. Just in conclusion, we'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to make this presentation today. We look forward to answering any questions or concerns you may have. We believe it is essential that the LES and Jobs Club are provided with the opportunity to continue with its successful model of providing a community-based, not-for-profit employment service. We endorse the work of ILDN, acknowledging that the future of public employment services is best served within a not-for-profit model. The National Committees of LES and Jobs Club have recommendations for the Joint Committee. The first recommendation is the continuation of a not-for-profit community-based model with equal recognition given to all progressions. All client groups to be assisted, one-parent families, people living with disabilities, job seeker transition recipients, part-time employees, qualified adults, underemployed in new communities, etc., as well as the most disadvantaged activation clients and other client groups who are not currently receiving any state assistance. Provision of a person-centred service with an engagement model based on need rather than set time limits. Multi-annual contracts for forward planning and stability of employment as recommended by the Indicon report. And a partnership approach with the DEASP systems to provide an improved client-centred service. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both Mr. Coffey and Ms. Kennedy, for your opening remarks. I have a significant number of people who have indicated they want to contribute. So the way I'll deal with this is the members will have an opportunity to ask a number of questions. I'm conscious of the fact that ILDN had a number of people who didn't make any presentations, and you're more than welcome to contribute to the responses. That's to all of you, not just those who made the opening statements. I am not suggesting everybody needs to answer every question, but feel free, everyone, all of the witnesses who are here in the front, feel free to respond to the issues raised. To the members, I'd ask you to confine your times quite strictly today, because I have a significant number and I want an opportunity for our witnesses to respond. So in the order of the people have shown to me, Deputy O'Dea.
Thanks very much, Chairman. First of all, I want to welcome the Irish Local Development group and also SIP2 representatives, and I want to thank them for coming in, and we were delighted to be able to facilitate them, and I think we did a good job in facilitating them because they've made two very excellent, very compelling and very comprehensive presentations, and I congratulate you on that. There's just a couple of general questions. First of all, I think you mentioned in your submission there, Donald, that you had a meeting with department officials after a number of futile attempts to meet the Minister. You had a meeting with a number of department officials on the 20th of March. Did you get any sense that what was the outcome of that meeting? Did you get any sense that the government were changing their mind about this public procurement thing, which in my view is a fiction, or were they still holding to it? And secondly, what is the present percentage? You refer some people directly for employment, you refer some people for training, further training, education, etc. What is the percentage between one and the other? And has that changed with the end of the recession? Has that significantly changed? Now, just a few general points to make there. I agree. It seems to me that your case basically is that the Indicon recommendations that you don't agree with, namely the reduction of resources because of the fact that unemployment has reduced, and also we'll come to the public procurement thing, but the one about reducing resources because employment has improved, that's fatally flawed. This is my understanding of your argument, because the initial purpose of the LES was people who were the furthest distance from the workplace, the long-term unemployed. That focus obviously changed during the recession, and you had other categories to deal with. But now we're back to that. And the Indicon report, apparently, that recommendation is based on the LES as it was in the height of the recession, not as it is and it has to be now. And indeed, that's reinforced by the fact that the Indicon report themselves, I notice, do recommend specifically that you focus on the long-term unemployed. There's a few things there. I don't want to hog the time because a lot of speakers. I fundamentally disagree with that proposal from Indicon for the reasons stated. Insofar as economies of scale are concerned, well, economies of scale, I mean, they have a certain attraction in theory or on the surface, but we're dealing with economies of scale now in relation to the changes to MABS and the other sister organisation, and the jury is very much still out on that. So I'd be very hesitant before I'd get into economies of scale here. In relation to public procurement, I agree with you. I mean, if you have a system of public procurement along the lines suggested in the Indicon report and seemingly supported by the Minister, you're going to completely eliminate the community and voluntary sector. You won't be able to participate. You won't be able to compete in a public procurement situation. I think myself that the explanation about the European rules is quite fictional. I mean, I agree with you actually. I was reading up those rules recently, and it does seem to me to fall clearly within services of general interest. But, there's just one message I want to go out from here, and it's this. There are some suggestions, maybe wrong now, but there are some suggestions that the government want to sort of proceed with a sort of a latter-day reheated version of JobsPath, and that will be the focus for the future. Well, I just want the government to know now quite clearly that my party is strongly opposed to that. We will not support that. We have a great habit in this country of fixing things that aren't broken. A lot of things that should be fixed we don't fix, but we've developed a habit of fixing things that aren't broken at all. The LES model, clearly, the JobsPath model, the Jobs Club model is not broken, and I don't think there's any need to fix it. So.
Thank you very much, Deputy O'Dea, and thank you for sticking to the time. Deputy Brady, 5 minutes as well. 5 minutes.
Yeah. And like Deputy O'Dea, I'd like to welcome you all here this afternoon, and very, very insightful opening statements from both the ILDN and indeed SIP2. And I have to say I agree with everything that is contained in both. And it's important to state that whilst we have views in here, I suppose making your opening statements, we have the Minister, which I think is the critical part of this process in before the committee on Thursday. So it's important we hear what you are saying, so in turn we're able to put those concerns and observations, questions out to the Minister. Unfortunately, I believe this is an ideological battle that we're involved in, and the seeds have been long planted. And I say that because at a time, and you have it here in 2012, when the unemployment rate was at 16%, a 6.7% decrease in the unemployment figures through the schemes that work before the ideological onset of the privatised model, and that is JobPat, Torres Nua and CTEC. And when the Minister stands up in the Dáil or comes in here and says JobPat, it's the most successful labour activation scheme in the history of the state, you know, I'd refer her over to these statistics, these figures. And it raises the question as to why the Minister did not, or her predecessor at that point, the government at that point, not look at the successful schemes and seek to broaden and expand those schemes that actually are working. Because she didn't do that, the government didn't do that at the time, because they're ideologically driven by privatisation and handing it over to the payment by results model and the privatised model. And I think we're here because of JobPat. And when we have a look at other statistics here, where the Indicon report shows that there was a placement rate of 28.8%. And that's just for employment over 30 hours, not including the other activations such as training or education and all of the key components that, you know, break down the barriers facing individuals, irrespective as to how long they're away from the workforce. It deals with the individual specific needs, but those critical components aren't taken into consideration. And if you compare that to JobPat and the privatised model, where there's a mere 14% placement rate that was given to Torres Nua and CTEC. So, you know, you can see, you know, a complete, I suppose, polar opposites there as to what the Minister deems as successful, even though they're not even reaching those targets of 14%, because if you see the people in long-term employment for 12 months or more engaging with Torres Nua and CTEC, you see a massive fall off of the figures. And again, the figures contained here by our colleagues in situ, €2,544 for full-time employment placement for 30 hours or more, and that's not taken into consideration the other activations there, whether it's training or whatever. And I think that is money well spent, and I think that could, you know, it's a fraction of that if we were dealing with reality. And if you compare that to JobPat, which is, I'd say, in excess of €3,718 per full-time job. So I suppose what strikes me reading through the Indicon report, if you have a look at the role of the mediator, and I deal with an awful lot of people that come, you know, not just the first time through JobPat, the second time through JobPat. Now we have people referred over to JobPat for the third time, and not taking into consideration their individual needs or what they need in terms of upscaling, skilling or whatever, are mental health issues. And I see here reading in the Indicon report that the role of the mediator, they can refer for counselling. And I think that is critical. It's very, very important, because again, it cuts to the chase. We're dealing with the individual's needs, as opposed to in the privatised setting where there is no scope for that whatsoever, referring over to the counselling. And again, the mediator fund, just a couple of other points there. And again, the stark difference between the privatised and indeed the local employment services. Just a couple of points there, because I agree with most, just around the procurement. And the most important point there is, you know, opening it up for public open procurement. You know, reading through the Indicon report, I do not see any argument there whatsoever. You know, no arguments put forward whatsoever. Even looking at the EU procurements, I don't think that stands up. So this recommendation seems to have come out of thin air. And we need to get clarification on that legally. We need to get clarification from the Minister, because I do not think it stands up. And the 20 million condition used for job tender, it simply cannot be used if indeed the Minister pushes to drive this out for public procurement, because I think the not-for-profit community-based model is the model that works, and as Deputy O'Dea says, if it's not broken, let's not try.
Thank you, Deputy Brady. Deputy Smith.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for your presentations. Very, very interesting, and some very useful analysis in it. Two things that jump out at me. First of all is the recommendation by Indicon that we should move to an open public competitive procurement model, and I immediately think the National Children's Hospital broadband cervical check, great model, what? Look at the results it's already given us, what a recommendation. But what I really liked was the challenge to the idea that we must move to a public procurement competitive model, because otherwise we would be flying in the face of perceived EU requirements on competition and policy rules. And I think you've put a very good challenge to that here. And what I'd like to see this committee doing, because I just said it to Deputy Brady there, we haven't actually done it, and that is to invite Indicon in to address their own recommendations based on the report that they give, because all of the boxes they tick in relation to the services that have been provided to reduce unemployment locally by all the schemes that exist there show fantastic results. So the one figure that does jump out is before the for-profit model of employment motivation, or employment, what would you call it, activation was brought in through JobPath, etc. Between 2012 and 2015, there was a 6.7% reduction in unemployment through these methods that you guys provide, as against, let's look at the reduction that has been achieved by CTEC or Toras Nua since then. And I think those figures would really beg the question of Indicon, where do they get this idea that we must move to public procurement? I want to ask one question though, and maybe one of the people involved in the Jobs Club could answer it, is that in the submission there's a list of the client group that present with multiple barriers, and include, you go from limited education, no work history, homelessness, low literacy skills, age, distance, ill health and addictions. Disability is not included there. Could I get a comment on any ability programmes that might be funded, or how they're funded, or why they're not funded, from anybody on the panel, and what actually happens in the question of disability? And finally, just to say that it's very, very clear that the model that you have presented to us is one that works with communities, that works with human beings, as against a punitive for-profit model that actually gives you an I. Daniel Blake result in very many cases. We've had evidence here very recently about how CTEC and Toras Nua is panning out in our communities. We've had witnesses in, we've had a scheme from Wicklow in describing the sort of detrimental impact of the privatisation of dealing with labour activation. It doesn't work. It's a for-profit model. It's not about the people. It's not about the communities. And clearly Indicon's report is telling us that the models we have get results, and if it's fixed, why try to, or if it's not broken, why try to fix it? I think it's because it is ideological, and it is this idea that we must do what the European Union tells us. We must do everything on a public procurement competitive model, and the evidence given here in your submission clearly refutes that, and I want to thank you for it.
Thank you very much, Deputy Smith. Senator Nash.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to welcome you all here today, and thank you for accepting the invitation that I think was originally extended by Deputy Brady and I for you to appear, because I think it's very fundamental to this process that we hear directly from those on the front line who are providing this important service, a service that I certainly value. Despite these angelic good looks and this baby face, I've been a public rep 20 years, believe it or not, and I've used the services in Louth, in Drogheda and in Dundalk, but Drogheda predominantly, a lot, and referred many constituents through those services, as other public reps have. and public reps with some experience don't refer and use services like the LES to the Jobs Club if they don't work. And we all around this table know and have the evidence ourselves from our own work that these services do exactly what they say on the tin. I'm concerned that this review draws conclusions and makes some recommendations that actually aren't really bedded in the narrative of the report at all. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the proposition that there would be a competitive public procurement process for labour activation schemes and the types of sustainment supports that are required, that they would be put out for public tender, I think is a little bizarre. And I say that from a number of perspectives because I think there's significant evidence and enough evidence, even objectively analysed, in the Indicon report to justify the continuation, not just the continuation but the strengthening of the LES and Jobs Club model across the country if we are to address the very deep and entrenched problems that we have in terms of the number of jobless households in this country. I mean, we tend to congratulate ourselves as a system every month when the live register figures come out and when we drill deeper into CSO data in terms of the very welcome, indeed, and growing employment rates in this country. But we also ignore willfully, I think, the fact that we have 1 in 6 jobless households across this country, I think, which is a huge stain on our society and a problem in terms of economic and social cohesion into the future. And successive administrations haven't managed to deal with that. And as I say repeatedly, I mean, the idea of work is not necessarily only about the weekly or monthly pay packet. It's about the dignity of work. And it's about the contribution that work makes to our society. And LES and Jobs Club have an enormous role to play now and in the future in terms of reaching those hard-to-reach citizens who require wraparound, customised, tailored services that the pay-by-results, profit-driven model cannot address in any way to anyone's satisfaction. And I'm not convinced either that an open procurement system is required. It's not required at all, based on the points that you made earlier on and points made by Deputy O'Dea and others. And I am convinced that there is, at the top of the system, and I don't necessarily mean the political system, that there is an ideological motivation that insists that private is good and public or community-based approaches are bad. And that is unfortunate. And the reality is, and I'll be front up with you, a political campaign needs to be run over the next short period of time to convince the political system and indeed the higher echelons of the public service that we need to maintain and grow these kinds of services that are so critical if we are to address the issues that those 1 in 6 jobless households face, because it's only through this community-based activation model that can be done. Just in conclusion, if I may, Chair, ask Michael Bowe just to articulate a little bit more, or elaborate, I should say, a little bit more on the fact that you've developed a proposal for a community-based activation programme ongoing, because I think that it is really, really important in the context of what we're facing into over the next few weeks and few months, and this challenge to this system, that the Irish Local Development Network, LES and Jobs Club, and indeed SIP2 and others who favour this approach would outline precisely what it is you and I, indeed, are in favour of, and not just what we are against. Because I think it's important that those of us who believe in this system should articulate that and should ensure that we are leading the debate on this and not just responding.
Thank you, Senator Nash. Senator Conway-Walsh.
Thank you for your presentations. As was said, I have had great fear for many years around the activation process. You know that this started off in France. It was first mooted many years ago, and then the government took it on here as being the way forward. And even the European Anti-Poverty Network at the time, I know, critically analysed it in terms of what would happen. And since then, we've seen, obviously, the 149 million being spent on JobPath. So I just want to ask you a couple of questions first around that. Have any of you here seen the contract between the department and the private companies that have, in fact, and we have to name it, have displaced a lot of the services that were provided by the LESs in communities? Because we have never been able to get the full details of the contract in terms of what was promised. Now, I want to get on to, and I want to ask you, what do we need to do to stop the privatisation of activation services? Because collectively we have to do that one way or the other. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked in any country we know. But I want to get on to the Indicon report. How reliable do you think the data and the statistical information is in the Indicon report? And I would suggest that the information within that and the statistical information is incorrect or inaccurate. So if I take a county, for example, like Mayo, it identifies that there are 65 pathways to work referrals in 2016, when in fact there were 650. Also, it states that there was only 5% attendance rates, which would obviously be brutal, but in fact the attendance rates in Mayo were 80 to 90%. Also, in terms of the report being done just over 1 year, wouldn't it be common practice and good practice for a report to be done over a number of years to get an accurate picture of where things were? Then, in relation to what is said within this report, and I'm reluctant to give it credibility, and it certainly shouldn't inform the way that we go forward in terms of activation and job services. But are you aware of the department having any plans drawn up? Because it cites that there's a surplus of staff in relation to the numbers on the live register as they are. So are there discussions taking place with staff or with the union around what's going to be done? Are you aware, have the department drawn up a plan in relation to the dismantling of the existing structures in terms of redundancies, lease agreements, contracts with service providers and the disposal of assets? So I'd really like some answers to those questions. Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. Thank you also for the very good work that you do. And I think it's absolutely disgraceful, the displacement of the services within the LESs, the displacement by privatising of them is terrible. And also, I know that, you know, within the services, within the LES, how open can the services be when you're dependent on the department for funding? I have a problem around that in terms of maybe people being forced to collude with the pathway that you're being brought down in terms of the provision of services. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Higgins.
Thank you again very much to the presenters. I think you've made the case so strongly in terms of the work that you do, and like many others, I also know that the work you do is thoughtful, is effective, has a meaningful impact. And in a previous, as well as discussing and speaking to people who've navigated unemployment and have found support from local employment services and jobs clubs, I also had the opportunity in the past myself to work with Wexford Local Development Network around a group of young rural unemployed people. And what was very striking about that was that the space was made to listen to them, and to listen to them as a group, and to look at what the joined-up supports might be for those who were young and unemployed in rural Ireland. And that is the kind of capacity to listen, to put together supports, to actually temper the supports offered to the needs of the individual and of those in particular contexts, which I think the local employment services have done, and it's very, very important. But also, just on straight statistics, the fact is the 28.8% level is much higher than the for-profit services. And I would ask maybe Mr. Bowe or any of the others from that service, we know that the Jobs Club presentation mentioned that 26% went into jobs of over 30 hours and 23% went into jobs of under 30 hours. In addition to your 28.8% of who have gone into jobs of over 30 hours, do you have large numbers who've gone into under 30 hours? And we know the importance, for example, of those who may be lone parents or caring. To build labour market attachment is the foundation for a pathway into employment in the future. And with the 15 hours childcare that is available, I know that there are many who start with the 15 or 20-hour working week as their journey back. So perhaps you might comment on that cohort, because again, the very blunt measure of 30% hasn't captured it. I was also struck by some of the other measures. The fact that 89% of employers said they'd been provided with a suitable candidate. When you look to the kind of revolving door experience for both employers and and job seekers who have navigated the other system, the fact that suitable candidates are being provided and that suitable employment and suitable options are being offered. I was very struck by the emphasis that was placed on equal recognition being given to different outcomes, because for me, for example, an outcome in relation to somebody returning to long-term education is important, and perhaps you might comment on how you, even though the system does not allow you to capture that maybe as it should, can monitor those kinds of impacts. Again, in relation to the local development networks, because there are those other supports offered through community supports offered through the local development networks, if you have seen ancillary benefits from those who have navigated your systems in terms of maybe the knock-on effect of those who may be either younger or older than working age, but whose family members are navigating the system, because we know there have been quite distressing impacts on both children and older people when they see others navigating a system or navigating penalties within another system. I want to just go to, in the limited time we have, to the issue of procurement. The European directives absolutely do give scope, and I know that you've quoted the community workers' research on this. Services of general interest, you're completely correct, are allowed. And in fact, it was interesting, Job Path was the first time when competitive tendering European directives were being cited as the justification, when in fact these kinds of social services are very explicitly excluded and allowed for. And as we go down a privatised route, what is true is that it becomes harder to roll back from it. And I think that that's a really important issue. I'm bringing legislation this week in terms of, if we do go the competitive tendering route, which I don't believe is the most appropriate route, the question of using, and I'm concerned some of the Indicon report, they just use cost-effective, which is actually a term that's out of date. The term now is most economically advantageous tender. And there is absolute scope within the European directives to make price and quality of equal value in determining that. And again, the kinds of measures, the kinds of holistic, those things, could you comment on the kinds of quality criteria that you think should be put in place in relation, if we go that route? Though again, as I say, I think it is a blunt and inappropriate route, and my legislation this week would try to make price and quality the default model, with lowest cost becoming an exception rather than the rule. And I would agree with others that the case isn't made on competitive tendering. I want to just finish by pointing to what I think are one or two of the key advantages potentially in relation to it. I think you mentioned, it was mentioned, and I think made very clearly, that those most distant require a different quality and level of support. And while the unemployment numbers may have been reduced, and I note that they were reduced from double figures to single figures through the work of local employment services and jobs clubs, before any private for-profit actors entered, from double figures to single figures. In that context, we know that we have been debating in the same chamber earlier this week the just transition the fact that climate changes, for example, measures that might be taken in the state are going to require the retraining of large numbers of people from current sectors and into new sectors. And if perhaps you might talk about how that kind of joined-up approach that the local employment services and jobs clubs could offer could be of support as people transition from certain industries into new careers and into new options. I come to conclude, and I think one thing that points to is the flexibility that is there when you are not operating for profit, because you are not having to answer to shareholders. And I do support the idea of multi-annual funding as recommended by Indicon, but I know that there is more scope when you do not have to answer to shareholders on their estimated returns each year within, and perhaps you might comment on this, within things like the local employment service, to respond to a new need, to an impact of Brexit, to an impact of a climate change measure or the closure of a sector. That flexibility within multi-annual funding that I think a service that is not constrained by an obligation of quarterly returns is able to deliver. If you could comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. Just before I hand back, and I'll afford all of you an opportunity to respond, I'm conscious of some of the comments that you've made, specifically as we look to the redesign of a new programme, and you're welcoming of, say, multi-annual programme and so forth. But we can't look at what happened in the last 4 or 5 years and say we're going to repeat that for the next 4 or 5 years. We're looking at a different problem and a different in front of us. Yes, we had a recession. Yes, we had very high unemployment, and that has come down. And I think, Mr. Bowe, you referred to the expression of post-recession, and we're in a different situation. The problem we are facing today is people who are long-term unemployed, many of them from what we would have called geographic economic areas of which would have traditionally had high unemployment and still have high unemployment, individuals who come from a background of intergenerational unemployment, and they are not issues that will be addressed in the same way as would have been addressed for somebody who lost a job for a year or two and retrained and reskilled and re-entered the labour force. We're looking at a different issue. And the one concern that I have, one very major concern I have, is when the Indicon report talks about, maybe centralising and economies and efficiencies. In my view, it needs to be the exact opposite. It's the more local response, not just of the employment service, but to engage with other providers of services in the area, because the people you're dealing with are further removed from being employable. It's intergenerational, it's long-term, and there is a piece of work to be done with people who are at school age today. If you're going to take communities that have suffered long-term unemployment, you need to work that far back into the system, not just the person who currently is on the live register today. So I think from the point of view of the presentation made by the ILDN, one of the key advantages is being community and locally based, the connections you have with other organisations in the area. I think that's hugely important and is probably not reflected adequately in the Indicon report. That would be my view of the Indicon report. I'll take the comments. Will I start with SIP2? Caroline, do you want to go first?
I will, yeah. I'll address
Mr.
maybe...
Coffey, you feel free to join in and we'll work across.
I'd just like to address a couple of questions that Deputy O'Dea put across to us. There was no definite outcome from the meeting with the DSP recently. You also asked about the employment and training, the percentage difference. I can only speak from a Limerick perspective, and there has been a difference insofar as you would, say last year's figures, 2018, you're looking at a 25% transition into employment, and there still would be 10 to 15% of people engaged in activation and training programmes. So that hasn't changed over the last number of years. There's still about 10 to 15% of people engaging in that level, which is not recognised with the work that we do. Thank you. I'd also like to address maybe Deputy Smith's comment around people with disabilities. We work with people who were referred and who are on the live register, and generally people who are on a disability payment don't fall into that category. So often people who do present to us may have a hidden disability. We do engage and support that person as best we can, and often we would refer to the employability service, which is a specialised service for people who have disabilities. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes,
thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment to Deputy O'Dea's question about that meeting as well. I just noticed coming in here there was a statue of Countess Markovic, and I made reference to the centenary. So I think she's the first Minister for Labour. She was the first woman Minister for Labour as well, and she was from the West. I'd just like to pay tribute here to Noreen Parker. She's from the West as well. She's our SIPTU person, and I know she's travelling the length and breadth of the country representing the community sector. Eddie Mullins, her colleague as well. But unfortunately, I have to say that this current administration and the previous administration as well, I'd use a phrase that our friends up north have. It's a cold, in this House at the moment, it seems a cold house for trade unionists. Sorry, they say that. They don't seem to receive much of a welcome. Our colleagues, the community employment supervisors, have been trying to get the issue sorted out since 2008. We're now 2019. This matter still hasn't been resolved. I know it's not the party here, but I think it's, when the question was raised, I think it's important to raise it. So it's like 11 years, and all they're asking for is a pension entitlement. They've been working, some of them, like for almost 20, 25 years, and they haven't got it. I know it has been raised with yourselves as well, but like that's, I'd say, the current minister, I know her father, I think, was a trade union activist, and I think she might like to revisit that, and perhaps that a cup of tea and a bit more warmer welcome, and more important, a listening and follow-up will be afforded to trade union colleagues, because they're representing a sector that's working in the coalface of difficult areas, and like, if they're not taken seriously, if they're not being followed up, well, like you could have end up a situation like you have in France, where you've mayhem and chaos on the streets, like the Gilets jaunes. So I think the people who are in the powers that be, maybe they can, but I think they should be remember what they should be doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. Mr. Bowe, I might leave you to last because you did the opening statement, and maybe I'll let your colleagues respond to some of the queries first, if that suits. I'd start at the back row and I'd do the front row then. Ms. Fitzgerald.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I suppose in relation to the local development companies, we have prepared a model of a local company led employment services. So we'll circulate that as a paper. So I'll briefly cover some of the key points within that. First is a point around local development companies. We're non-profit, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But also we have we're in every community in Ireland. There are 49 local development companies. We are in every urban setting, every rural setting. We have reach into every parish and group in Ireland. So we have this national coverage that the department has identified as a priority for delivery of employment services going forward. So we have the infrastructure. This infrastructure can also deliver somewhat economies of scale, because we already have the capacity, the staffing. We can do it more in the areas where we don't have funded LESs at the moment, and we only have them in 25 locations. So to expand that to be in counties where none exist, like Roscommon, Leitrim, all of that, with a little bit of additional investment, we can upscale to provide those services in those areas. A very important thing about the local development companies is the boards of local development companies are made up of the areas of interest in those communities: employers, trade unions, healthcare services, education services, local bodies, local public reps indeed constitute part of the board. So we have that local knowledge and local investment from the community infrastructure in an area. Local development companies are, I suppose, big enough and small enough. And I think that's very important. All the research in social inclusion, and the core purpose of local development companies is social inclusion. It's not profit. It's not employment services only, it's not education services only, it's not disability services only. It's all of the matters that pertain to the promotion of social inclusion throughout the country. So that's very important, because that speaks to the need for the wraparound services that people who are the most excluded in society actually require. They require services that actually are throughout the lifespan, and local development companies offer services throughout the lifespan on an integrated basis. So that means services for families and households, where we are interacting with those families and households in terms of early years education, preschool, national schools, secondary schools, transition to third level, working with young people who are early school leavers. So it's not just that we do one thing. The purpose of today is looking at employment services, But we do much more than that, all of which are required to work with those most distant from the labour market. When you only work with people who are the most distant from the labour market around employment, you're missing all the other factors and the impact of those factors. The unique, I suppose, aspect of local development companies is our ability to actually work in a wholesome way across the lifespan with actual people. Non-profit. I suppose we're non-profit, but what does that mean? We don't make a profit, but we do. Our profit is the communities in which we serve. Our profit is the social benefit that accrues through our work to the community. So, in a way, there is profit. It's not cash and dividend for shareholders, but it actually is profit for communities and the individuals and the citizens of the state. I suppose we're asked what do we need to do, and we're at a sort of a crossroads at the moment and where we're actually going as a society in terms of the services we'll provide, and it is a matter of political will which model we will actually choose. So that's why this opportunity to present is of huge value. So it is a political choice. Will we go a for-profit road on this, or will we stay within the non-profit road? I suppose in relation to public procurement, and there is that mixed view at the moment of does it have to be, doesn't. In late 2017, the Department of Social Protection went to tender in relation to a national programme for people with disabilities, of which partnership companies actually work, and we do deal with them, not always under the headings that are funded, but under our other programme headings that are very important target group. So they went to public procurement in relation to the National Ability Programme. That procurement was restricted to non-profit companies only. So we do have precedent in relation to how we do this as late 2017. We have the wraparound services, again to emphasise that go throughout the lifespan. Our outcomes, we have outcomes across the lifespan. We can demonstrate this. We have an evidence base for our work now that's established through the capacities of staff and their strengths over 20-odd years. So we have the infrastructure to deliver going forward. So thank you for the moment.
Thank you very much, Ms Fitzgerald. Mr O'Reilly.
Thanks, Cathaoirleach. And I suppose the first thing to say is we would welcome, I suppose, the national coverage of this, because at the moment the Local Employment Service and the Jobs Club do not have national coverage, whereas most of the other programmes like SICAP and TUS and RSS have that. And I suppose coming from a rural area where we can provide the service in some areas, LES, in the other areas where it's not provided, it's covered by SICAP and other areas. So we would certainly welcome that, and I think the union side of the House welcomed that as well. Just to specifically answer some of the questions, I suppose when you're talking about jobs that are not they're under 30 hours, I suppose it certainly affects the rural areas as well, because some people will be involved in tourism, which is maybe, I won't quite say precarious, but it can be, and pluri-activity. So there's jobs coming and going. And while the system does recognise it on the system, we can track those, as Caroline said earlier, we can track those. It's not taken into account then in the reports or in the Indicon report, which I think is a real pity, because, as you've all alluded to, it's about the whole quality of life of people and helping that, rather than just a paid 30-hour-a-week job. There's a lot more to it than that. In relation to the climate action and just transition and that, I suppose the fact that we're integrated companies, and Anne mentioned that earlier, I suppose we can also bring it across to the rural development side and the leader, because we, over the last number of years, we have done things like ecotourism, rainwater harvesting, biodiversity, and it means that as integrated companies on the ground, as you mentioned, Caroline, we can respond to local needs that are relevant to the local areas. We're like delivering national policy in a locally, community-led way. And I think there's real advantage in that, because we can respond locally to national policy, national needs, And I suppose the other area I'd like to just respond to is, like you mentioned about the long-term unemployed and others. So we also bring in other programmes, as Anne mentioned. For example, we have a Moving On project under the PEL initiative, where women are returning to the workforce who are not on the live register. And that's a really, really successful programme. We have over 100 women working on that at the moment and coming through that. So I think, again, going back, we're in a very flexible position, very locally grounded position, and managed by voluntary boards as well, which I think is hugely important to say, who are fairly driven and focused on their own local areas, represent their own local areas, and want to see that. So thanks, Caroline.
Thank you, Mr O'Reilly. Mr Saunders or Mr O'Neill? Who?
Thank you, Chair. Just very hard to address all of the comments made, because I've done some sort of a list. And just to mention the economies of scale, which Deputy O'Dea This economy of scale is an imaginary thing that has happened in the UK. And one of the impacts that the job work programme in the UK has had is to destroy local community groups. And that goes from the urban to the rural. Myself and Mr. Bowe have visited some of them over there, and I have relations with groups in Liverpool and London, and they have been at the pin of their collar to stay open to the public. And what has happened is that the work programme has sent people to these charitable organisations for training without contributing to the training, and yet claim the benefit when somebody gets into a job. And I wouldn't like to see that repeated here, but there is a sense that there's an element of that happening in Ireland. When we look at the not-for-profit, we know that not-for-profit has served the state extremely well in providing services that the state could not do, either at a local area level or at an economic level. And we've provided those services, and it runs from mental health services to ordinary health services, lifelong learning, to dealing with migrants. Somebody asked about disabilities. We run IPS, which is individual person support programs for people with disabilities. There's an array of stuff out there that we've worked on, and we'll continue to work on it, and that's where we should be. I think on the procurement side that there's some sort of an illusion there that the EU is directing that this has to go to public procurement. That is not correct. The mention there of the recent one, but SICAP is a model which was been approved by the Attorney General. So this is not just something that was taken off the shelf and run with willy-nilly. It was actually approved by the Attorney General. We've given the department, senior department officials, copies of the entire procurement suite of documents so that they can understand exactly how SICAP operated for the not-for-profit. And we would like to see that happen. And we welcome the bill that's been introduced, which brings into effect an EU directive. And as Deputy Curran knows, I've been talking about this for a long, long time. It is one of the few countries, is Ireland, who do not actually adopt this directive. So we're not actually, we're out of step, because we're not actually looking after the social inclusion part, the social services part of the tendering processes in Ireland. We go spectacularly for the buck only. And my final comment would be that there's a history and there's a skill and there's a level of skill among our staff. We work in a society, we don't work in an economy, and we want to continue to work in a society that cares for the least well off. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill. Mr. Saunders.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like three quick comments, I hope. The first is I'd like to thank members and welcome the reading and research and thought they've put into the report and the issues before us today. I suppose the first thing that comes out of multiple comments is members' concern as to whether the findings of the Intercon report lead on necessarily to the recommendations, and in particular recommendation to consider a privatised model. So our reflection on that would be very clear. It is a non sequitur. It does not arise from the evidential findings in the report, the proposal to automatically move to consideration of competitive procurement. Secondly, I want to address the issue of a number of societal challenges that members have raised, whether they be climate change, Brexit, factory closure, automation, these things coming down the line. Where the LES and Jobs Club model has worked particularly well is because it's not just a job-first model, it works with people in employment. So those in precarious employment, bogus self-employment, and those whose jobs are at risk are part of the client base. And in that regard, every local development company has a link with its local third-level college, with its ETB, and at national level, ILDN is linked in to several colleges in the IT and university framework. So we're very concerned about the societal changes that come down the line and the need for reskilling as opposed to just a job-first approach. And finally, just in relation to that job-first approach, we have the Intercon findings, but we also have a research arm of the state, the ERSRI. And I just want to quote from its proposal for research for pre-employment supports from January of this year, where they say, as employment increases, those who remain unemployed are likely to experience multiple barriers to labour market participation, meaning that employment is far from an immediate, realistic prospect for many of them. And they go on to say that for these groups, job creation alone is not sufficient in ensuring full employment. So I think that reflects many of the members here concerns as to how we conceive of the issue. And in that regard, local development companies stand ready to, I suppose, offer national coverage and also to offer coverage to the new cohorts that need to be brought in and that deserve as citizens to have a national employment service.
Thank you, Mr. Saunders. Mr. Bowe, to conclude.
Thank you. Hopefully we'll address all the questions, and if we've missed anything, please come back to us. I'm sure you will. So, Deputy O'Dea, you reflected on figures at the opening, if I've got it right, and I hope I've got your question right, but I can confirm that the figures for 2017 and 18 for the LES and jobs are comparable to the outputs for 2016. Probably not quite as high as the 28.8%, but given that the cohort are becoming more and more difficult, then you would expect it to be less. But the figures still stand up in terms of the numbers that both the LESs and Jobs Clubs are delivering. And in relation to Jobs Club, the target is 40% for Jobs Club, not 30%. So I think it's actually remarkable, I will use, is the word, outputs, given the scale of the budget and what has actually been delivered. That would be the first thing. In relation to Deputy Nash, there will be a kind of an information, I don't know whether we like to use the words campaigns, with all of the senators and TDs over the coming weeks to try and convince them and try to convince the government of a correct way forward, not just a self-serving interest one for ourselves, but on behalf of clients, that the not-for-profit is not the way forward. And I say that for 30 years in this business, both at the front line and now as the CEO. In relation to Deputy Walsh, you asked two questions. No, we have not seen the contract, never have, so we have no idea of the contract at all. And I suppose you asked the question about the figures in the Indicon report. Well, that's an interesting question. If you take the two reports for around 300 pages each, as we read through them, there are definitely figures that you would disagree with in commentary. But in the overall scheme of things, what the Indicon report says, a service such as this is required. So you try not to get caught up in all of some of the parts that you might disagree with. And overall, though, I would believe the figures are reasonably accurate in the broadest sense, and some we would disagree with. I don't know if that's answering your question. So, because it's easy to have a go at page X or page Y or page Z, but overall, if you take some of the trust of it, you'd accept some of the figures, and then we would strongly, obviously, disagree with how some of the recommendations evolved out of the report. But we've commented on that. I think some of the other questions were dealt with by Anne, by Senator Higgins, and I suppose one last comment. There's a choice for our elected representatives at this point in time, and not just the government, is what do we want to do with the most vulnerable in our society, the 5%? And I'm very, very much, and we're all very, very much of the view that you cannot just because we've got full employment, we've done this before, we can't move off. For a relatively small investment, groups like ourselves or the community can work in the not-for-profit way and deliver a multitude of benefits, which may not all be about employment, about changes in lifestyle, household families, benefits in kids, etc. So the government must grasp this. It's not about the money at this particular point. It's not-for-profit. It's about what we want to do with the 5% in our society. That's what we play a part in. That's what we're committed to. And others play a role in that as well. So I think that's just an important thing. But I hope the collective part of the Dáil can bear this in mind, that just because we have X, we still need to provide services for that 5%, and it will pay dividends down the road.
Thank you very much. At this stage, I'd like to thank all our witnesses for their attendance today, the opening statements and the response to the questions. I think Deputy Brady clearly indicated this is a part one of a two-part process. We will be addressing the Minister next week. I think it's very important to be fair and compliment you on the presentations, because obviously while we have the Indicon report, we are looking forward to the future of some sort of new employment service. And one thing that I suppose, and I don't like to pick out anyone individual, but Ms Fitzgerald in particular indicated very clearly, was the range of services and the contacts that ILDN that the various companies have at community level, and that as we deal with people who are long-term unemployed, where there are greater barriers and obstacles, that type of local infrastructure, you explained that very well, and I think that was a point really well made. I'm going to conclude, but before that, sorry, Deputy Smith.
Chair, you had stepped out of the chair and out of the room when I
My
asked,
apologies.
would it be possible to get Indicon in to query them on their report? Because I'd like to know how they added 1 and 1 and got 6.
We'll address that in private session on Thursday morning.
Well, I was just thinking, if we're
that's-
going to have the Minister in on Thursday, would it be possible to get them in as well?
I wouldn't think so. We'll deal with, in private session, we'll deal with that as business. But I think we'll deal with the ministers. It's already pre-scheduled at this stage.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, Mr. Coffey. No, he's the chairman, but go ahead, Mr. Coffey.
Senator Nash mentioned about the difficult to reach section of the population. I suppose this whole thing has been a learning for me, and referring back to this, like when the LES started, we were a gateway for people in the community to reach information about jobs, etc. Because in Cork they had to go into city centres, quite difficult, and that's the whole idea of us going out to the community. But in fact, roll on 20 plus years now, the gateway is different. In fact, we're the gateway into the communities, and very difficult to reach. So, in fact, we're a resource, and through the LDCs, the partnerships, a lot of services could be actually, channeled through our offices. And particularly, I suppose, because we're linked up with the unemployment, and that's the libraries is a very universal church. So we meet a lot of people, different people. So it's a very useful thing, and I think actually the government underestimate the potential of the service. And I know, just finally, I knocked the cold house, but I would like to thank the frontline staff in the Department of Social Welfare and previously FOSS. They've always worked very closely with us, and I'd like to acknowledge this in this forum as a frontline worker. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. So once again to our witnesses, thank you very much. To committee members, we will now adjourn until 2:30 on Thursday afternoon. Thank you very much.